Thank you, Ezekiel. Thank you for those kind words. And welcome to this conference on investment and innovation. And when we think investment in our sector, I mean, most of us attend perhaps too many of these telecom conferences, and Fatima has attended many conferences this year, perhaps the rest of us less often. We talk a lot about Internet of Things, about 5G. And if you hear a speech about Internet of Things, you don't remember after a few days whether Cisco, Andres, predicted 20 billion devices or 30, or was it those connected to mobile that were 20 billions and the other 20 billions were not connected? And when you hear friends of Alcatel or Ericsson talk about 5G, you hear about this lightning speed on 5G. And when you hear these bright people talk about technology, it's easy to lose sight of why we need investment in telecom and why we are regulating this sector. And I may be a bit naive, but I really believe that technology is not good or bad. We all agree. If we play our cards well, if we regulate market properly, if the private sectors reacts to the appropriate incentives to invest, we have, with the technologies at our fingertips today, the cards to build a better society. And you can call me naive, but I really believe that with the progress that are made in alternative ways of generating energy, you know. Fatima talked about the risk of urban-rural divide, you know. The kind of spectacular progress that were made in the IT sector in terms of the computing power that you get for every pesos or dollar or euro that you spend, we are seeing the same curves now for solar panels. You know, so energy will be, we think, you know, in a decade or two, something that will be abundant, inexpensive, and that can be produced both in rural and urban areas. If I look at knowledge, which is increasingly driving our societies, if you're like me, if you think of the dining room of your parents 20, 30, 40 years ago, there was always these very nice books, you know, collection of nice books that perhaps sometimes you went to fetch to do your homework. It was called encyclopedias, you know, and some companies like Britannica or Universalis or maybe others in Latin America were making money by having, you know, hundreds of writers writing articles and selling you these. And for a family, it was like the big investment, you know, for the education of the kids. Now you've got Wikipedia, and Wikipedia has been done by just, you know, people like you and me who know a bit about a topic and contribute for free their knowledge. Linux, which Jim is probably the only real competitor to Windows on PCs, and which is also powering the largest computers in the world. Linux has been developed just like Wikipedia, by having volunteers, IT developers for fun, contributing a wonderful machine, you know. And if you combine all that, you know, knowledge that is free and spread, cheap energy, with the advance of 3D printers, you can suddenly have a completely different business model and possibly a better society than we had in the future. Today in Paris, I was reading the Huffington Post this morning, and Fatima and Gonzalo equivalent in France, the flamboyant Mr. Soriano, chairman of the ARCEP, the French regulator, is today attending a conference that is called Barbarians Attack Regulation. You know, barbarians are people that disrupt business models. And what the French are doing today, at least Sébastien is involved in that and he's very proud of it, they are inviting IT developers, you know, innovators, people that have got ideas, to come and speak to the French regulators to be challenged, to be disrupted, say, what do we need to change in the regulation to make, you know, innovation happen in France and create jobs and wealth, and this rosy picture of the future that I was trying to describe. I was reading the other day an article about IBM. IBM is just spent a couple of $1 billion buying a company called the Weather Company. You know, maybe you watch the Weather Channel from time to time. But the Weather Company is a company that, you may say that's $2 billion for a weather channel, that's pretty expensive, but beyond the Weather Channel, it's a company that has been spreading apps, you know, in millions around the world. And the Weather Company is now, its true value is the fact that it's able to collect and to aggregate data on the weather across the world, and has the clever algorithm to perform big data operation on that. And you may say, that's great, you know, IBM, with that, 2 billion, they're going to be rich. No. The commentator commenting on the, you know, the takeover by IBM of this company was saying, IBM so far has done the easy part. They signed a big check, it's a rich company, so no big deal. The real crucial point now is going to be to convince thousands of small IT developers across the world to actually tap into this wealth of data that IBM will present on a platform to create application to serve, you know, farmers in every country, to serve the tourist industry, to serve all the industries that basically have a business that depends on the weather. And I'm mentioning this as perhaps it's not the best example, but it shows that we regulators have a role to, I mean, I'm not the regulator, but the regulatory community, the people that have an interest in regulation, have a huge responsibility today. 10, 20 years ago, telecom regulators have a responsibility to basically build the highways on which one day the information society would come. Today, the information society is there, it's within reach. And the real responsibility is to transform, like Christian made a football metaphor with taking the mic from Ezekiel. This is really, I think, regulators and more broadly, authorities in every country have a real responsibility of turning this opportunity of having these fantastic telecom networks that are being built and that will be modernized into something that will change our societies for the better. And the key, I think, if there is one word that summarizes this mission that regulators, authorities, and all those who take an interest in this subject, the key word is trust. You know, you need to convince consumers, citizens, to contribute their personal data. This is increasingly, and we will have a session later this afternoon with Ezekiel to discuss that. It's increasingly, you know, a key ingredient of any new business model. At the same time, you need to reassure citizens that their personal data are going to be used, you know, to an end that basically helps their life, and they are not going to be monetized for reasons that they do not support. And then there are the complicated relation. I mean, it's very good, Fatima, that you decided in the previous meeting to have an academic program to dig deeper into regulation and for example, to look at the relationship between things like privacy and innovation. You know, in Europe, following a famous court case last year, we have now something called the right to be forgotten. I'm not sure exactly how you implement that technically. Some people say it's not possible, but at least a company like Google, that was of course in the line of shooting, is processed, I read 300,000 requests from European citizens that wanted to be digitally forgotten. And this is, I think we would all agree, a wonderful achievement from the point of view of you know, preserving the privacy of European citizens. At the same time, and this is, we have to take it with the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that it basically raises the barrier to entry to anybody wishing to compete with Google. Because for Google, it's probably a bad news to have to handle 300,000 requests. That's expensive. It means they've got to pay people for nothing, basically that helps their bottom line. At the same time, if you want to compete with them, you know, you've got to put down people to do this silly job. So you see the relationship between privacy and innovation, privacy and the assessment of any digital, of any dominant position. You know, in the good old days of telecom regulation, when it was a pure subject, you looked at who has the big investment, who has the high barriers to, and nobody's going to replicate copper networks, you know, so this is a bottleneck, let's regulate. That was clear, you know, where are the revenues? Who's got the billions of revenue? Today, the source of market power are much more diffuse, you know, it's more about, I mean, if you look at how much did Facebook spend for WhatsApp, you know, they had no revenues, they had 19 people, no, I mean 19 billion, less than 50 people, you know. So it's surely not, you know, if a traditional, you know, telecom regulator looks at that saying, a small company, no revenues, you know, no problem. But it's worth, the price tag shows that there is more than that, you know, later on in the session that I will have the privilege of chairing, we will talk about the OTTs. And I know, especially in a regulatory circle, you know, it's a bit our duty to have fights, you know. Telecom complain about OTTs stealing their revenues, and OTTs are complaining about telecom operators not playing by the books. What I want to stress is that behind this spectacular debate that telecom regulators have to witness in their countries every day, behind the scene, and it's less visible, both telcos and OTT realize that it is in their own interest of building an ecosystem, you know. OTTs are the guys that basically provide the justification for consumers to buy broadband connections, otherwise why do you want a broadband connection? Not to check regulators' website, that's not enough, Wanda, you would agree? At the same time, OTTs, I think need telecom operators because telecom operators have a billing relationship, they have huge sales force, they have a local presence. Sometimes they have a good brand, that's for you to decide. So this is something that we would like to explore also in those 2 days. Alors, turning to the agenda of this conference, later with Ezekiel we will have a session on the digital economy. And one of the topics that I think we will discuss is a bit of a sad story, I think, which happened in Europe this year. This is the end of what we call in Europe the safe harbor agreement that US companies, not the US as a country, but US companies had with Europe under the supervision of the Department of Commerce for the last 13 years. So basically, Europeans believe that since 1995 they have a pretty good protection when it comes to the privacy of the personal data of their citizens. And in order to help commerce develop across border, Europe and the US struck a deal 13 years ago to say, okay, the American legislation is not as good as the European, but if companies like Microsoft and Cisco and others commit to play by the European rules under the supervision of the Department of Commerce, it's okay to ship data to Europe. Now, you know, following the Snowden revelation that, it's a bit, I shortened the story, but the highest court in Europe, the European Court of Justice, decided that basically, you know, apparently it's not as safe in America as it is in Europe, and therefore all this transfer of data have to be stopped. Alors, from a privacy point of view, again, you may say this is a good news, and we have to, you know, abide by the decision of the highest court in Europe. At the same time, for commerce, you know, for companies that do business in the transatlantic layer, not just the IT companies, a company like General Electric that sells, you know, jet engines or energy generators, it's really make their life difficult. Also SMEs, you know, which are often less well equipped than large companies to cope with the situation. And the reason what I'm bringing this is to say that you agreed with my introduction that personal data is increasingly the fuel of the 21st century economy, we have to each to realize that in order to help our companies to develop, to internationalize, to gain a critical size, we have a duty as authorities to build bridges across border. You know, in the old telecom world, frankly, if Portugal and Sweden regulated in a completely different way, you know, I don't think it was a big deal, you know. But when you go to the application layer, and I'll take the example of the privacy rules, it is essential that a growing number of countries, and certainly think of your own country, if you want to help small IT companies to become bigger, you need to be able to have them tapping into the personal data of other countries. And your responsibility as public authorities is to basically harmonize privacy rules across border, which is not easy, or at least to try to build new safe harbor agreement across countries. I think it's essential. We will also have a session on media, on television, with Laura. You know, what is at the heart of TV regulation for several decades now is promotion of local content, promotion, limits to the kind of the quantity of advertising within your favorite movie or football match, protection of children, and all that, all those goals who are still very valid today, the implementation of those goals are a bit turned on their head with the advent of over-the-tops, you know, the like of... There is also on the TV front the possible disintermediation of telcos and cable operators. You know, this triple play was one of the new and probably the sole new source of revenues for the telecom industry in the last 10 years. And with the advent of Netflix, HBO Go, Amazon, there is a threat of having our telecom operators being disintermediated, basically providing the pipes to others selling. Now, it sounds a bit contradictory, but at the same time, there is another interesting issue around TV regulation is the market power that you can gain when, as a telecom operator, you purchase premium rights, for example, football rights, especially in countries like Portugal and many others from Latin America, where citizens are completely addicted to football. And so the regulator works very hard for many years to implement fixed number portability, to implement mobile number portability, to implement swift migration scenario for switching from a broadband provider to another, and then one operator buys, you know, the rights to the national championship, and all of a sudden, if you love football, you're not going to change, you know. So how do you, as a telecom regulator, account for that? And then with Elena, we will have a session on competition, investment, and innovation. And you know, we know since that this is for your chair on economics and innovation. We know since Schumpeter that innovation and competition go well hand in hand. You know, you innovate because you hope that for a few months, a few years, you will have a monopoly rental. It seems to be more months now than years. And Jim was telling me yesterday that he had the privilege when he was a student to study with Kenneth Arrows, and Kenneth Arrows was also a guy that thought that innovation and competition worked hand in hand because basically competitors wanted to. But there are also disruptors among the economists. Fatima, there is a French guy who is a professor in Harvard, Philippe Defraigne, a great guy. Philippe, he must be great. And this, Fatima, come, okay, you should quote Fatima on that. He's a great guy. And what he thinks is that he says, you know, this relationship between competition and innovation is more complicated than it sounds. Because, of course, if you have a monopoly operator, he's going to be a fat cat, he's never going to innovate. At the same time, if you've got too much competition, there are no more profit margins. So how do you invest into 4G, 5G? So, dear regulator, we need less competition in order to have more investment, yeah? Which has been the rhetoric used by the mobile industry in Europe in the last 2-3 years to try to sell the move from 4 mobile operators, which we had in many markets, increasingly to 3, which is the new magic number. I mean, some countries are still resisting, the English and the French. We will see whether and the Italians, whether they win. And then I finish with that, because Ezekiel says I'm talking too much. You gave me the microphone, you know what to expect. Eh? And then, yeah, we will have a session on next generation access. And I think the truth is, if you believe in competition, which you don't have to, you have the freedom of choosing your religion, I think regulators on the fixed side, let's talk fixed and then mobile. On the fixed side, regulators in many countries did a great job in basically developing competition in the copper network with local loop unbundling, bitstream, fantastic. What regulators are really struggling to achieve is to replicate that success in the next generation, in the fiber environment. You know, I mean, some are doing very well, like Portugal, I must say. You know, probably world champion with 3 competing fiber infrastructure, which is unheard of. But you know, you look at. I'm looking at my Italian colleague Laura. You know, it's not easy if you come to try to create, you know, infrastructure, fiber networks. Why? You know, why? You know, consumers don't really want it, you know, frankly. You know, because if you look at the countries, quite a few countries in Europe that have built good fixed networks, the take-up by consumers is completely disappointing. So if I'm Telecom Italia, I say, okay, why would I? You know, why would I? And on the mobile side, yeah, and something that is valid for both fixed and mobile, and which brings us back to our job as regulatory guys, I'm really convinced that regulators should do more to help the fixed and the mobile industry roll out networks. And you should do something with local authorities. You know, local authorities in every country are often one of the largest obstacles to actually the industry having decided to invest, to actually concretely deploy those networks. I know that there are some initiatives on the way, but this should be really a massive priority for regulators around the world, frankly. So, and then finally, if we talk about NGA on the mobile side, I think my friend from GSMA in the room and from the mobile operator will say, we need more spectrum. So we will have, with Carolina, a session on spectrum. But with that, I think that we should kick off our first panel, and I will ask my colleagues from the first panel on OTTs to join me on the podium, please. Please.